Shinto emerged from the life and culture of the Japanese people. It also originated from the natural landscape of Japan itself. Japan is a country of 4 major islands and many smaller islands, all situated east of China and Korea in the Pacific Ocean. So many religious traditions are found there that Japan has been called a living museum of religions. Buddhism, which originated in India about 500 BCE, took 1,000 years to travel through China and Korea before it was passed into Japan, sometime around 500 CE. Over the centuries, the Chinese traditions of Confucianism and Taoism also were transmitted to Japan, though they were accepted in Japan more as philosophical and ethical ideas. Many aspects of Chinese culture also came to Japan, along with these religious and philosophical influences. In addition to these imported traditions, however, one religious tradition emerged from the culture and experience of the Japanese people. This distinctively Japanese tradition is Shinto, and it began in prehistoric times. In fact, it was the importation of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism that prompted the Japanese to name their own tradition. Buddhism was known as the Way of the Buddha, so Japan's tradition of worshipping the deities called kami came to be known as the Way of the Kami. In the Japanese language, another way of pronouncing Way of the Kami is Shinto. On a number of key points, Shinto differs from the other Japanese religious traditions. Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism are all founded traditions, each established by historical or legendary figures who set forth basic teachings or religious messages. By contrast, Shinto has no founder, and it features no explicit set of teachings or doctrines. Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism all have cosmic or universal claims in their messages, meaning that they intend to speak to all peoples. By contrast, Shinto sees itself specifically as an extension of the culture and nation of Japan. So from the earliest times up through the Middle Ages, these 4 philosophical and religious traditions constituted the spiritual heritage of Japan. Some people, particularly priests and scholars, emphasized one tradition and excluded others. But most people, most of the time, tended to participate in several or all of them. Christianity first entered Japan when the Jesuit priest St. Francis Xavier brought Roman Catholicism to Japanese shores in 1549. Like Japan's other imported traditions, Christianity had been founded by a particular spiritual leader, and it made universal claims in its message. Yet in one important respect, Christianity presented a radically different alternative to the historical pattern of Japanese religiosity. It emphasized faith in the one true God, and it called for exclusive affiliation to Christianity alone. In spite of great difficulties, including a language barrier, the Catholic Church was able to convert a significant number of Japanese before the government banned Christianity in the mid-1600s. Some of Japan's so-called hidden Christians secretly preserved Christianity in a kind of underground existence, handed down in families. But even this suppressed Christianity was reinterpreted in Japanese terms. Christianity did not formally re-enter Japan until the late 1800s, when the Japanese government lifted the ban on Christianity. Missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, began mission work and opened churches. However, in the century or so since Christianity re-entered Japan, less than 1% of the Japanese population has joined Christian churches. Christianity also has not interacted freely with Japanese culture and religion, as other important traditions have done. For example, Confucian notions of loyalty and obedience to parents have become so thoroughly integrated into Japanese life that they are usually seen as Japanese rather than as something foreign. The same is true for the Buddhist practices of memorializing ancestors. Although Christianity has influenced Japan's ethical and social ideas, it still is perceived as a foreign religion.
There's a tendency in the West to judge other religious traditions by what a people believe or what they don't believe. We frequently ask them, well, are you this or that? Are you a Christian? Are you a Buddhist? And in the Japanese case, people will frequently say, no, I'm not religious. I don't believe in this particular deity. I don't go to this particular shrine. It's really the wrong kind of question to ask. It's more a matter of protocol, of social etiquette, of doing the right thing at the right time.
The Japanese people also participate in many folk religious customs and practices that are handed down outside traditional religious categories. These customs are part of Japanese home life, occupations, and local traditions. There are half a dozen or so different folk traditions in Japan, and they add to the complexity of Japanese religiosity. But actually, the situation is even more complex. Religion in Japan is quite diverse. Just as Christianity in Europe or America includes many different religious orders and hundreds of Protestant denominations. In Japan, Buddhism is divided into major branches and many denominations. Shinto also is not a highly unified religion with its diversity of festivals, practices, and local Shinto shrines. Buddhism expresses the way of the Buddha and his goal of enlightenment. Confucianism articulates the way of Confucius and his ideal of social harmony. Taoism can be regarded as the way of the legendary figure Lao Tzu and his aim of harmony with nature. And Christianity is the way of Jesus Christ and his plan for salvation. The best clue to the way of Shinto is the very word, Shinto. Kami is the ancient Japanese notion of what is worshipped, and it can refer to one or many objects of worship. The term kami, somewhat like the English word dear, can be singular or plural, and is much broader and more flexible than the English term God.
The notion of a monolithic, omniscient deity that controls everything from a Shinto perspective is a little too restricting, I think, because there are so many different situations, political, social, religious, that have to be dealt with, and it's the context that is so important. So it's not surprising that there should be different deities for different kinds of contexts. And even today, you may call upon one particular deity for a rite of purification, and another deity if you want to get into a good university, another deity if you're starting a business, or you're starting some new enterprise that deals with money. So it's all very context specific and very pragmatic.
In general, the way of the kami means to live a pure life in harmony with kami. In ancient Japan, kami were so numerous that mythologies referred to them as the 8 million kami. This doesn't mean that there were or are actually and precisely 8 million objects of worship. Rather, it indicates that kami are beyond number, that they are myriad or countless. Kami are found throughout Japan, especially in natural forms such as mountains, waterfalls, trees and rocks. Kami can also refer to powerful human beings and even human ancestors. Because there is no exact equivalent for kami in English, usually it is not translated. The closest English term for kami is probably the sacred, in the sense that there is power and mystery within nature and the natural fertility that produces new life. Scholars usually introduce a religion by describing a founder, analyzing basic scriptures, and interpreting key teachings. But in the case of Shinto, if we want to know about the way of the kami, it may be best to look at actual cases of worship of the kami. Shrines have long been important to Shinto, even since prehistoric times, though the earliest Japanese worship probably occurred not in shrines, but in nature. In modern times, Shinto shrines can be found throughout Japan in cities as well as the countryside. These shrines are quite different from one another. They may be huge and imposing, or they may be tiny wayside buildings. Some are ancient, others of recent construction. Every Japanese lives within walking distance of a Shinto shrine. Traditionally, the shrine closest to one's house is considered the tutelary or protective shrine for the family. The Japanese don't regularly worship at Shinto shrines in the way that Christians or Jews gather for congregational worship on a specific Sabbath day. The Japanese, instead, will visit a Shinto shrine on a specific occasion to offer a prayer to seek help, or perhaps to attend an annual festival. A number of features distinguish and preserve the sacred character of a Shinto shrine and its grounds. At the formal entrance to the shrine is a sacred archway or gate called a torii. The torii marks the passage from the everyday world into the holy grounds. It symbolically protects the grounds from evil influence, and it makes those who enter realize that special religious behavior is appropriate there. On other personal or family occasions, such as a birth or marriage, many Japanese will pray at a shrine for help or blessing, or to give thanks for previous benefits. But the Japanese visit a shrine most often during festivals, and the single most important Japanese festival is the celebration of the New Year.
%86 of the Japanese population turned out over the 1998 New Year's to pay a visit to a Shinto shrine, to probably buy something from that shrine, like an amulet or a talisman of some sort, which they will put at home to protect their home and protect the people that live there. Maybe they'll put it in their car for transportation safety. Maybe they'll attach it to a bag that they carry every day to work or to school. So it's really a matter of practice. And over time, these practices have a kind of momentum to them that induces or encourages belief. So I would say it's practice first. It's social etiquette, doing the right thing at the right time to relieve, to manage anxiety, to empower the individual, and then maybe later on, belief will accompany that.
In front of the shrine entrance, and on each side of the walkways to the main shrine, there will be many vendors selling food, trinkets, and souvenirs. Many lights will be strung about and lit in the evening. There may be live or recorded music as well. Huge numbers of people throng to these shrines. They often are so many that police are necessary to control the crowd. The earliest written records of kami are the works entitled the Kojiki, written in 712, and the Nihon Shoki, written in 720. These two works are similar to many other mythological writings and scriptures in that they begin with tales of creation. The Japanese works first focus on the activities of many kami and then shift to historical accounts of emperors and their dynasties. The Kojiki gives the most purely Japanese version of ancient mythology, painting a picture of heaven and earth coming forth out of a watery and unformed substance. The Nihon Shoki interweaves Japanese mythology with Chinese philosophical notions that are used to interpret the creation. Some early passages of the Nihon Shoki refer to the Chinese concept of yin and yang, that is, the negative and positive, or the female and the male. Ancient Japanese beliefs and practices were first influenced by the Chinese sometime around 500 CE. At this time, the ancient beliefs in the kami and other beliefs as well were reinterpreted along Chinese lines. The foremost of these kami are the divine couple Izanami and Izanagi, who are responsible for much of creation, and the sun goddess Amaterasu, from whom the imperial line is descended. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are the earliest known writings on ancient Japanese mythology, and they are important records of Japan's ancient beliefs. But they are not considered to be scriptures, like the Bible in Christianity or the Vedas in Hinduism. Shinto priests and thinkers do grant them a sacred status, but most Japanese people regard them as imaginative or fanciful writings. In other words, legendary materials rather than scriptural authorities.
Shinto has a very pragmatic part to it, especially in the ritual context, where the deity can be called upon to be present. But of course, the deity can manifest itself at any time and in any place. So there is always that unpredictable, spontaneous aspect to the Shinto deity, which may manifest itself as a typhoon, or as a bolt of lightning, or as a clap of thunder, or as a river that goes out of control. Likewise, it may manifest itself as sun or rain when it's most needed and when it's most beneficial to the people, to the crops that are being grown, or to the animals also.
Japanese beliefs and practices go back many centuries before they were first written down in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. And what we see in later Shinto is not necessarily the same as what existed in prehistoric times. Shrine buildings and even the word Shinto itself were not found in the prehistoric period. Only when new religious traditions entered Japan was there a need to distinguish the native Japanese religious heritage from other traditions. We saw in the Nihon Shoki how Japan's indigenous notions of creation and the birth of many kami became blended with the Chinese notion of yin and yang. There was no attempt to choose between an indigenous Japanese version and a Chinese interpretation. The Japanese instead simply combined the Japanese and Chinese traditions. The same kind of interaction occurred between Shinto and Buddhism. Initially, there was some friction between the way of the Buddha and the way of the kami, but over time they have blended in many ways. Indeed, Buddhism had blended with native beliefs and practices throughout Asia, and this pattern continued in Japan. In Japan, a Buddhist divinity came to be considered the original divine essence, and a corresponding kami was seen as a manifestation of this original essence. It was as if a Buddhist divinity was one side of a coin, with a kami on the opposite side of the coin, and this was the rationale for worshipping Buddhas and kami in the same ritual setting. To people from the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this blending of deities may seem strange. The monotheistic ideal is to worship and maintain faith in the one true God, and a person belongs to or participates in only one religious tradition. Yet throughout most of Asia in general, and within Japan in particular, the dominant pattern is what we may call multiple affiliation. Here, someone participates in more than one religious tradition. People and even priests may celebrate two or more traditions during the same ritual, or they may alternate between one or more religions. In Japan, most people have participated in both Shinto and Buddhism. It was an exception when a few people, especially Shinto priests, limited their religious participation only to Shinto. In general, Shinto was overshadowed by Buddhism for more than 1,000 years. But through the ages, some learned Japanese insisted that Shinto was the original and true religion of the Japanese. Many of these arguments that Shinto is Japan's original and true religious heritage came to fruition in the writings of the 18th century scholar Moto Ori. Moto Ori says that Japan, the kami, the emperor, and Shinto were created as one seamless unity. Kami do not stand outside the world and create it, but rather are part of the process through which the world gradually emerges. The kami also are not exclusively a force for good. In Christianity, the one true God is considered to be all good, and evil enters the world through human sin. But in Shinto, both humans and kami can be evil.
This aspect of benevolence that the kami can impart, and also destructiveness, in the way that a kami can exert its power upon the natural world and upon human societies, we shouldn't think this as being in opposition to each other. We should think about it as a kind of complementarity between these powerful benevolent forces and the destructive forces, because as religions recognized very early on, it's this complementarity that allows for progression and allows for change.
The importance of birth and growth also is reflected in Japanese beliefs about the world and its place between the heavens and the underworld. The ancient Japanese believed that Japan was related to the heavens. It was a good country that was to be ruled by the descendants of the sun goddess in one unbroken line for ages eternal. Muraoka writes that the heavens, which are called the transcendent realms of the plane of high heaven, were believed to have a real world quality. The underworld, called Yomi, also was thought to be real.
It's important to keep in mind that even though we have this notion of deities in Shinto kami that come down from heaven, the high plane of heaven, to the earthly plane, we shouldn't think about them as being supernatural or somehow above or divorced from the natural world, because these deities are very much a part of the way things operate in the natural world. One of the qualities of the Shinto kami is that they come and they go. They do not reside in this world. It's often said that Shinto is a nature religion, and that the deities reside in trees or in waterfalls or in rocks. The priests certainly say that these deities come and go, that they can be called upon to come down from heaven, and then they can be sent off. Because the last thing you want is some powerful, unpredictable deity hanging around your rice fields and having to always take care of that very important celestial visitor.
A basic principle of Shinto is that life inevitably involves a tension between the pure and impure. The goal of life should be to maximize purity. In this way, one becomes close to the auspicious kami and receives their blessing. A human body is seen to be good, and yet it creates waste, which is impure. The body must be purified when it approaches the kami. The Japanese think of purification in a way that somewhat resembles ancient Israelite ritual practices, and their concepts of pollution and purification have little in common with Christian teachings about sin and redemption. In Christianity, sin means the willful turning away from God. When the Christian sinner asks forgiveness, he or she seeks to be redeemed through God's grace, thus being restored to a loving relationship with God. But in Shinto, pollution is not necessarily caused by disobeying or turning against the kami. It can be what modern people would consider a natural or accidental condition or event. Ritual purification is essential preparation for any Shinto worship. A Shinto priest first recites a stylized prayer of purification that incorporates the themes of the Izanagi myth. The pollution is understood to be corrected by exorcism, which drives out the impurity both through physical cleansing and through the power of the kami. Just as the body must be physically pure in order to worship, there also must be serenity and sincerity in one's heart. Physical pollution is the most obvious kind of impurity, but Shinto theoreticians also emphasize the ethical and spiritual dimensions of purity. Kami and purification are central to Shinto. The places where kami are worshipped are shrines, and the persons who lead the formal worship are priests. The two most important buildings are the sanctuary, called a honden, and hall of worship, or haiden. The sanctuary enshrines the kami. Physical representations of kami, such as statues, are very rare. Usually, the kami's presence is symbolized by an object such as a mirror. A kami often is considered to reside in an ancient treasure which is not shown to the public. In the hall of worship, ceremonies are performed by Shinto priests. Ordinary people usually climb the steps to this hall, and they present their offerings and prayers outside without approaching the sanctuary. Since early historic times, most formal Shinto worship has taken place at jinja, in other words, at shrines, sometimes without any benefit of clergy. But there always have been some religious specialists within Shinto. Shinto has never had a universal hierarchical order of priesthood, such as that within Roman Catholicism, and the training, practice, and ranking of Shinto officials have varied considerably. Today, there are various offices and ranks for the priests who recite prayers and perform rituals in Shinto ceremonies. The shrine priests, most directly responsible for rituals, are called kannushi, literally meaning divine master. There are no official rites for becoming a Shinto priest, as there are for Buddhist or Christian priests. In some rural settings, male heads of families traditionally take turns serving as Shinto priests at their local shrine. Male priests are the general rule in contemporary Japan. However, it is worth pointing out that in the earliest stages of Japanese history, it was empresses rather than emperors who ruled. These empresses reigned partly by virtue of their ability to communicate directly with the kami, as in a divine oracle. When emperors came to rule in early historical times, the religious role of the empress was lost. We've already seen that before Shinto worship, the worshipper purifies hands and mouth with water and recites a purification prayer. All of this draws on the mythology of Izanagi's bath. Then, high-ranking priests recite a norito, or sacred prayer. All who are present prostrate themselves as the ritual prayer invokes, or calls down, the kami. There is more music and other offerings. The most important offerings are branches of the sacred tree known as sakaki. As in the rituals of many other religious traditions, Shinto assumes that the kami partake of the spiritual offerings. Communication with the kami ends when the ritual prayer announces the ascent of the kami. Many people travel quite far to visit a large or famous shrine for a festival or for a particular blessing, or just to buy an amulet. These people generally are worshippers, not parishioners. Yet in the traditional village setting, it still is taken for granted that people within the area are parishioners of the local shrine. Most traditional Japanese homes, and some modern homes, feature a small Shinto shrine. The Kamidana is a miniature version of a Shinto shrine that's usually installed on a high shelf in the house's main room. Family members may make offerings at the Kamidana, and from time to time, especially at New Year's, they may bring a new paper talisman from a nearby Shinto shrine and place it on the Kamidana. In ancient times, the people of one clan worshipped the same kami. But in medieval times, the people who lived near a local shrine automatically were considered to be the parishioners of that shrine. In other words, affiliation with a local Shinto shrine depended on one's place of residence. Everyone within that area was considered to be blessed or protected by this tutelary kami.
There is always this underlying orientation to the world that has what we would say today would be a Shinto perspective to it. There are deities of the land, of the natural world, of ancestral spirits that have to be controlled and maintained. Now, layered upon that are traditions of Buddhism, Confucianism, even Taoism, even later on Christianity, that are not in opposition to. They are in harmony with, and they are syncretic with this earlier orientation. However, at the end of the feudal period, when the Japanese state modernized, there was a split between the old regime, the reformers that wanted to revitalize the Japanese state, bring back the emperor, and basically to be able to defend the nation of Japan from imperial powers such as England, Spain, Portugal, France that were in the area. They felt like they had to do what these powers did. They had to find a spiritual engine to drive this vehicle of modernization. And Shinto was considered to be the most viable candidate for this.
Yet in modern times, especially with Japan's greater religious freedom after World War II, the situation within Shinto has changed considerably. With increased social mobility and the relative anonymity of large cities, many Japanese people have no sense of being a parishioner of a certain shrine. In fact, many Japanese don't even know which shrine would house the tutelary kami of their area.
One of the ways that Shinto helped in the modernization process was to create a notion of community, that we are all one people as Japanese, because basically until 1868, Japan was a fragmented area where there were particular clans that ruled particular areas. But from the 1860s onward, there was this notion and a legal entity of the Japanese nation, of the Japanese state. So Japanese had to be created. The emperor was instrumental. Kami and the alignment of kami, the involvement of kami with each community and the lives of common people was also very, very important in this whole process of creating the modern Japanese state. Part of this is still with us today in Japan because it does still provide an orientation to the universe, to social relationships, to the relationship that people have with the natural world.
The feudal country of Japan became a modern nation-state in 1868. To understand the significance of 1868, we must go back to the preceding era, when Japan was a collection of feudal territories, each territory ruled by a feudal lord. These territories together were controlled by a military dictator called a shogun. The time of the Tokugawa shoguns lasted from about 1600 to 1867. During most of this time, Japan isolated itself from the rest of the world, and much of the nation's intellectual, ethical, and political thought was dominated by Confucianism. Yet its religious life was Buddhist because of events harking back to the mid-16th century. Christianity had entered Japan in 1549 at the hands of Saint Francis Xavier. It had flourished for about a century before missionaries were persecuted and Christianity was banned. To maintain the ban on Christianity and to control the people, the Japanese government officially supported Buddhism, which, in the mid-17th century, became practically the established religion of the land. Every Japanese family was required to belong to a local Buddhist temple, and all births, marriages, deaths, and changes of address were registered there. Beginning in the late 1700s and early 1800s, a number of problems began to plague Japan's feudal government. The economic imbalance between rich and poor led to peasant revolts and urban uprisings. European countries and the United States were increasingly pressing Japan to open its borders to trade. These and other internal and external pressures caused a growing sentiment within Japan to remove the shogun and to restore the emperor to more direct rule. The late 1800s in Japan were full of attempts to implement a parliamentary government that would be headed by the religiously symbolic figure of the emperor and legitimized by the religion of Shinto. Western countries criticized Japan's prohibition of Christianity and demanded that the ban be lifted. In 1873, the Japanese government relented, allowing Christianity to be practiced and Christian missionaries to be active in Japan. In essence, the Shinto way of life now became a civic and natural duty of the Japanese citizen. School books now taught that Japan was created by the kami and that the emperor is descended from the sun goddess. These beliefs came to be seen as national history and national culture rather than religion. Students were required to bow and venerate the emperor's photograph. At the same time, formal religion was banned in the schools, so Buddhism and Christianity could not be taught. In the drive to unify the people and strengthen the nation, Japan's government linked ancient mythology and official Shinto to absolute loyalty to the emperor, and also to unconditional support for colonialism and militarism. For the first and only time, a large number of Shinto shrines were built outside Japan.
So it was very much in the interests of political leaders to have rituals that were amenable to controlling not only the natural world, but also the ancestral spirits of their household, of other clans, of the people in general, and of people at the lower levels of society, or the non-elite levels.
In the 20th century, especially during and after the 1930s, Japan's schools became much more strict. The curriculum taught absolute loyalty to the emperor and to any policies undertaken in his name. In short, Shinto became very closely caught up in the war effort of World War II. Yet Japan's Buddhists and Christians also strongly supported Japan's war effort and her militarism.
(1931). Japanese troops leave for the conquest of Manchuria. Japan, the first of this war's aggressor nations, starting out a full 14 years ago on a career of international conquest and pillage. Shanghai in 1937, full-scale warfare against China. The world was still unready to deal properly with such wanton aggression. Japan's diplomats addressing the League of Nations attempted to justify their crimes against peace and decency, and then walked out. The long series of brutal attacks upon an unprepared neighbor continued. Japan seized a whole new empire. December the 7th, 1941. Japan's fanatical suicide corps in desperation air attacks inflicted heavy damage on American naval forces off Okinawa. This was kamikaze. It was sensational, but it could never stop the Allied advance.
World War II ended in 1945 with a devastating defeat for Japan. Japan's colonial thinking now collapsed. All Japanese religions had supported it, but Shinto was most closely identified with the war effort. When Japan unconditionally surrendered in 1945, Western allies imposed a number of conditions for religion. For the first time in Japanese history, there would be complete religious freedom, not only as an ideal, but also as an actual practice. World War II was settled in 1945 on terms that ushered in a radically new democratic way of life for the Japanese. The Japanese scholar Shigeyoshi Murakami notes that the nation-state of Japan produced state Shinto, and a democratized Japan produced freedom of belief. In short, the Japanese state was now officially separated from religion. The emperor was required to announce that he was not a kami, although the form of his announcement later came to be seen as highly ambiguous. Shinto lost its protected status as a non-religious system of commitments. It also lost state subsidies, and its many priests were no longer government employees. Japan has a rich variety of very old religions: indigenous Shinto, Indian Buddhism, Chinese Taoism and Confucianism, European latecomer Christianity. Yet Japan has seen the creation of hundreds of new religions in the 19th and 20th centuries. Many Japanese were experiencing a rapidly changing social setting, and they were dissatisfied with the solutions offered by the existing religious institutions. Yet they still were strongly attracted both to traditional themes like the cultivation of virtue and to long-standing customs such as ancestral rites. Many Japanese were drawn to religious leaders who developed their own teachings and practices, and who helped to resolve questions about personal destiny and social order. The Japanese people still believed in the power of both the Buddhist divinities and the Shinto kami. But much of the vitality in these traditions was found not in the organized aspects of Shinto and Buddhism, but rather in their folk religious practices. This set the stage for the new religions that would soon emerge. Japan's religions of the 1800s were mostly characterized by their focus on living kami. Some of the same religious needs were met also by a living kami in the new religion called Tenrikyo.
Our kami, God the Parent, is a God who created this world and mankind and any other creatures. The purpose of creation is to see our joyous life by helping each other. And God the Parent protects us in every ways so that we can lead a joyous life. In that sense, God the Parent is all to us.
Nevertheless, Shinto lives on in strange ways, many of them beneath the surface of daily routines and commitments. It is well to remember that Shinto never was a highly organized religion like Christianity. Japanese religiosity is not defined by exclusive membership in one religious body, and there is no weekly congregational worship. So the usual measures of religious commitment are not easily applied to Shinto. Yet Shinto lives on, even when it is denied or neglected. Shinto has long been a part of Japan's life and culture, virtually since the beginning of Japanese civilization itself. And as long as Japanese culture exists, Shinto probably will continue to be a meaningful part of it.